Basically, to understand fluid and electrolyte balance, we're going to talk about different acid-base disturbances. So meaning that acid-base balance is out of whack, and how do we diagnose those different disturbances and what's really going on in the body physiologically. We're also going to talk about buffers, right? How buffers work in the blood, and how the respiratory system and the kidneys work together to maintain that acid-base balance. Okay, so we'll start off by looking at interactions between fluid and electrolyte components. And this is something we already talked about already, just tying it all together. A couple of points here. The increase in solute reabsorption increases osmotic gradient for water reabsorption. We talked about the movement of water. We talked about the medullary osmotic gradient. And we talked about how the increased solute reabsorption and what part of the tubules. Where do we have the increased solute reabsorption on the tubules in terms of the osmotic gradient or the medullary gradient? So the statement says increase in solute reabsorption increases the osmotic gradient for water reabsorption. So what part of the tubule is this referring to? The loop of Henle, correct. So the ascending limb has that increased solute reabsorption, and the descending limb has that increased water reabsorption, right? And then again, we have countercurrent, depending on each other. Again here, ADH, some of you may have an earlier version of this PowerPoint that accidentally said ADH. It's supposed to be aldosterone, right? Aldosterone increases the number of sodium channels in the apical membrane of principal cells, right? So please note to change that. It's not ADH. ADH increases the aqua horn, right? The angiotensin 2 increases ADH secretion. We spoke about the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system that also increases ADH. So that renin or that angiotensin 2 did two things. It had two jobs. One was to activate aldosterone. The second was also the activation of ADH. So that angiotensin 2 had a twofold effect on the kidneys. And then finally, ANP decreases ADH secretion. We talked about ANP and ADH and how they were sort of antagonistic of each other. Right? ANP being the atrial natriuretic peptide we talked about. Anyone remember the job of ANP?
Increases the sodium channels at the layer.
Correct. So decreases those sodium channels on the apical membrane of those epithelial cells, specifically at the regulatory parts of the tubule, so the collecting duct and the distal tubule. All right, and so that's going to decrease sodium reabsorption, and that's going to be antagonistic to ADH as well as aldosterone. Physiologic response to hemorrhage. We talked a lot last week about hemorrhage, that scenario of losing blood volume, decrease in mean arterial pressure, which basically means decrease in perfusion pressure, right? You're bleeding out, or you're hemorrhaging, or you're extremely diarrheal, whatever the scenario may be. We talked about the different reflexes that were brought about as a part of that, that scenario. The baroreceptor reflex, right? Which would then in turn stimulate the secretion of ADH and activate the RAS system. Right? Why would you want to activate the RAS system if you're bleeding out? Very simply put, why would you activate the RAS system if you're bleeding out? What is this going to do for you? What is renin going to do for you? So the renin, angiotensin aldosterone system is going to have the end effect of aldosterone, which you just mentioned, is going to decrease those channels or those channels in the membrane, which will help to bring back your perfusion pressure, right? We spent a lot of time last week talking about this. All right, moving on to our second objective here, which is to talk about different factors that influence acid-base balance. Okay, now just to set the groundwork for acid-base, for this discussion about acid-base balance, let's talk about the pH of the arterial blood. So the blood in your body has a very narrow window, very narrow pH, about 7.35 to 7.45. Outside of that window, things get very chaotic in terms of the cellular environment, in terms of blood vessels, in terms of nerves. And so that tight window is very important to homeostasis, right? If we go below 7.35, we get what's called acidosis, or an acidic state in the body. And if we go above 7.45, we get a more alkaline environment. We get into alkalosis, or a basic environment. Right? The opposite of acidic would be basic. Complications with these disturbances come about because of the proteins, right? The proteins in our body need to be at an optimal pH. Outside of that pH, they become denatured, right? They don't function the way they're supposed to. Some of them overfunction, right? And so keeping that narrow window is very important for proteins. An important example that we talked about last semester was the glycolytic enzymes in muscles. The glycolytic enzymes in muscles become their proteins, right? They become denatured at a certain pH. And so that's why if you're working out, you're doing lots of strenuous activity, that lactic acid buildup creates an acidic environment, and those proteins, those enzymes cannot do what they're supposed to, and they lose their efficacy. Okay, so that pH is very important. When we talk about nerves, when we talk about neurons, acidosis is going to decrease the excitability of the neuron, whereas alkalosis is going to increase the excitability. It's going to make it more easier to fire an action potential. Okay, and that can create problems in itself. In terms of the potassium balance, we know that acidosis leads to hyperkalemia, right? Those hydrogen ions, that acid in the blood loves to follow potassium. So lots of potassium, lots of acid in the blood, lots of hydrogen ions in the blood, lots of potassium. Potassium will follow. And the opposite is true. So alkalosis is going to be resulting in hypokalemia. Another complication is cardiac arrhythmias. Again, keeping the excitable tissues within that very narrow window is very important. All right, we talked about the autorhythmic, the pacemaker cells of the heart. They need to be within that 7.35 to 7.45. Otherwise, they can be overexcitable or underexcitable, and that can lead to arrhythmias in terms of the rhythm and beat of the heart. So just to talk about ways that acid comes into the body, comes into the blood. One would be your diet. So proteins break down to release hydrogen ions, that's acidic. Fats break down, right? The breakdown of fats is keto acids. And so the metabolism of carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of metabolic activities within the cell, right? CO2 must be released as a part of creating ATP to sustain those metabolic processes. Lactic acid, again, is another byproduct that is created from skeletal muscle. That creates an acidic environment. And then keto acids, again, which are the breakdown products of fats. So these are some ways that acid actually gets into our blood. These are the inputs. The outputs would be the kidneys and the lungs. So the kidneys have the ability to secrete hydrogen ions into the urine. We'll see the parts of the tubule that is where that occurs, as well as carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is basically a biological acid. And so when we breathe that carbon dioxide out of the lungs, we're getting rid of that acid. So these two outputs are very important in balancing this acid base in the body, the kidneys and the lungs. Let's talk about some respiratory disturbances. So we know carbon dioxide is a biological acid, right? And we know the normal PCO2 in the blood is about 40 milligrams or milliliters of mercury. And this is maintained by the respiratory chemoreceptor reflex. And this is a big fancy word for saying there are areas in your brain, right, that are detecting how much oxygen or carbon dioxide is in your blood, right? If you have too much carbon dioxide in your blood, they're going to send a signal to your lungs, to your diaphragm, to your respiratory muscles to increase the rate of breathing. Why would you increase the rate of breathing if you have excess CO2 in your blood? What is that going to do for you? It's going to help blow that CO2 off. So the stimulus that is picked up in the blood is the level of CO2. Those chemoreceptors detect that there's too much CO2 in the blood. This is creating an excess acidic environment. Let's send a message to those respiratories. Let's send a message or a signal to the respiratory centers in the brain, which will in turn increase ventilation, and that will help blow off some of that CO2. So this is how the lungs play a part in correcting some of these acid-base disturbances. Let's talk about metabolic acidosis. So this is a gain or loss of hydrogen ions, which is acidic. This is a gain of hydrogen ions, or a loss of bicarbonate. So when I say that there's a metabolic acidosis, this means that through some other mechanism other than the lungs, right? This is not including the lungs. That word metabolic is telling you this is not happening at the level of the lungs. This is nothing to do with breathing. There is either a gain of excess hydrogen ions, excess acid, or there's a loss of bicarbonate. So essentially, there are two ways to be acidotic. There are two ways to get into an acidotic state. Either you have too much hydrogen or you have too little bicarbonate. So bicarbonate is that basic component that's supposed to balance the acid. Some of the ways we get a metabolic acidosis is if there's high protein in the diet. Again, those inputs are too high. If there's lots of protein coming in the diet, the breakdown products of that would be excess acid, high fat in the diet, excess exercise or heavy, high intensity exercise. That's gonna lead to excess lactic acid release, which again is gonna create that acidic environment. Now, what type of muscles, this is like a throwback question, what type of muscles would contribute to this metabolic acidosis? What type of muscle fibers? Skeletal, yeah, but what type? Is it oxidative or glycolytic? So when we talk about buildup of lactic acid, what type of muscle are we really talking about? Glycolytic, right? That glycolytic process, which is where we have that buildup in the lactic acid. All right, so don't forget that stuff we did last semester. This is a building process. Other ways to get metabolic acidosis, severe diarrhea, because you lose lots of bicarbonate, right? If you lose bicarbonate, you are going to get into an excess acid state because of that misbalance. Questions?
So would this be more common to see with people with C. diff?
With
C. diff?
It can be, yeah, it can be. So there's a different electrolyte that's thrown off in C. diff, which gets a little bit more complicated, but it can be seen in those diarrheal states. As well as vomiting. So vomiting is another way that we lose acid. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then renal dysfunction. So if there's any sort of misbalance in your renal dysfunction, you're not able to secrete hydrogen or you're not able to reabsorb bicarbonate, you can get into acidosis. Let's talk about metabolic alkalosis. Now again, the defining factor of metabolic alkalosis is that this is not occurring through the lungs. There's an increase in the pH other than the buildup of CO2. So this can be excess vomiting where you lose hydrogen ions. This can be consumption of alkaline products like baking soda. Or again, this can be a renal dysfunction. If there's some issue or pathology in the lungs, specifically at the level of the proximal tubule or the collecting duct, and you are not able to reabsorb bicarbonate or secrete hydrogen, you can get into a metabolic alkalosis. All right, so remember, there are two ways to get to these states. Either building up of one component, right, so building up of bicarbonate, or the loss of hydrogen. Let's talk about the 3 lines of defense. The first one is going to be the buffering of hydrogen ions, right? And when we say defense, we mean how does the body protect against these disturbances? So let's say you have a high protein diet and you're bringing in lots of acid. What does the body do to prevent any sort of disturbance in the acid base? So again, buffering happens in the level of the blood, and this is basically limiting the changes in pH. So it's not going to reverse any changes in pH, it's not going to fix it, but it's going to prevent the impact of any exaggerated acid-based disturbances, right? When you think about the word buffer, it means to sort of take the blow or absorb the shock, right? To limit the impact of something, and that's exactly what buffers do. The second mechanism is the respiratory compensation. Okay, so if you have an acidosis that begins in the metabolic system, right, other than the respiratory system, the lungs can kick in and they can help to regulate that process. They can help to bring about homeostasis. Vice versa, if you have a situation that starts in the lungs, let's say you're hyperventilating, let's say you're an asthmatic patient, and you start hyperventilating, you're blowing off too much acid, you're blowing off CO2, you will get into a state of alkalosis. And so the kidneys will in turn compensate for that disturbance. Okay. All right, so again, buffering means that we can reverse the change in pH, and this is a regulatory mechanism. This is how the body brings about homeostasis. So if there's excess hydrogen concentration, the kidneys will work to increase the amount of hydrogen that is secreted out into the urine. And the bicarbonate, the absorption will also increase, right? If you have excess acid, you want to increase the bicarbonate in the blood, and so that will be reabsorbed at a faster rate. And the opposite of that is true.